The packed hearing room buzzed with anticipation. Cameras clicked, papers shuffled, and whispers circulated among the staffers and spectators. Today was no ordinary session. Everyone knew something was about to happen. And at the center of it all was Jasmine Crockett, standing poised, calm, and ready, facing one of the most respected figures in the judiciary, Judge Elena Kagan. For months, Crockett had been preparing for this moment. The topics ranged from procedural questions to policy critiques, but the underlying tension had nothing to do with law books. It was about control, authority, and accountability. Kagan, known for her patience and precision, entered the room expecting the usual protocol: polite questions, measured responses, occasional probing. But Crockett had something else in mind as the hearing began. Kagan opened with a customary greeting, her tone courteous yet firm. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, "we will proceed with your questions, but I expect adherence to procedure and respect for the bench." Crockett nodded, her expression neutral. She didn't flinch. "Thank you, Judge Kagan. I understand completely. Let's begin." The first few questions were procedural, a test of tone and strategy. Kagan's measured responses were deliberate, designed to assert control without escalating conflict. Crockett, however, was watching for inconsistencies, gaps, and opportunities to clarify her points. Then came the first sharp moment. Crockett's voice was steady, almost conversational. "Judge Kagan, in reviewing the recent procedural updates, there appears to be an ambiguity in how discretion is applied during preliminary motions. Could you clarify how that discretion aligns with broader standards of judicial accountability?" The room seemed to tighten. Kagan raised an eyebrow. "Congresswoman, discretion is applied according to the guidelines established by statute and precedent. Ambiguity exists where the law allows flexibility." Crockett pressed on, calmly laying out examples from recent cases. Each example was precise, citing dates, rulings, and procedural nuances. It was factual, unembellished, but undeniable. Every time Kagan attempted a diplomatic deflection, Crockett followed up with another documented point. She wasn't aggressive. She was relentless in clarity and logic. Spectators leaned forward. Even Kagan's aides exchanged glances. Here was a congresswoman who could challenge the expectations of the room without disrespect. It was a delicate balance, a rare skill in high-stakes hearings. After half an hour of measured exchanges, Crockett shifted focus. She addressed a controversial decision that had caught public attention weeks earlier. "Judge, some observers believe that the interpretation applied in Case 47 to be diverges from established precedent. How do you reconcile that interpretation with the principle of equal application of the law?" Kagan paused. This was no longer about procedural ambiguity. This was the point where public scrutiny and legal expertise collided. She responded carefully, choosing each word with precision. But Crockett's follow-up questions were direct enough to press for accountability without accusation. "Congresswoman Crockett," Kagan said, her voice composed yet hinting at surprise, "I appreciate your diligence. Your questions are thorough. But the bench cannot comment on interpretations beyond the published opinions." Crockett's response was calm but pointed. "Judge, the purpose of this inquiry is to understand the reasoning behind decisions that impact public trust. Transparency ensures that interpretations are not only legally sound, but also publicly defensible." The exchange intensified subtly. Kagan, renowned for her judicial composure, began to show signs of recalibration. She adjusted her posture, paused longer between sentences, and leaned in slightly when Crockett spoke. It was clear the dynamic in the room was shifting. Crockett wasn't backing down. She wasn't trying to intimidate. She was using reason, evidence, and composure to maintain control of her narrative. Observers in the room whispered among themselves. Social media feeds had already begun live-tweeting the tension. Analysts predicted viral headlines. Crockett's ability to challenge the bench without aggression or disrespect was mesmerizing. As the hour passed, Crockett introduced the final documents for the session, detailed comparative analyses of case law, procedural precedents, and public statements. Each page was methodically referenced. Kagan examined them carefully. Even the most skeptical onlookers could see the meticulous preparation and command of the topic. Finally, Crockett leaned back slightly, signaling her intent to pause. She gave Kagan a composed, steady look and said, "Judge, I appreciate your time. My goal is not confrontation, but clarity. The public deserves transparency, and accountability must be consistent." Kagan nodded, visibly impressed despite the subtle tension lingering in her posture. "Congresswoman Crockett, your preparation is exceptional. You have presented your questions thoughtfully and substantively. We will proceed with this session as planned." The room exhaled collectively. For a moment, the dynamic had shifted, not in confrontation, but in mutual recognition of professional rigor. Crockett had proven that calm, evidence-based reasoning can command attention, even in the presence of authority. As the hearing recessed, cameras lingered on Crockett's poised demeanor. Analysts already speculated that her approach would become a reference point for effective, assertive, yet respectful questioning in high-profile hearings. And while the session had only covered preliminary topics, one thing was clear: Jasmine Crockett wasn't going to back down. Judge Kagan had realized this, and the world was watching. The courtroom reconvened after a short recess, but the energy in the room had changed. Jasmine Crockett returned to her seat with a quiet confidence that drew glances from both reporters and aides. Judge Kagan, typically calm and controlled, seemed to have a subtle tension in her posture, her eyes attentive to every movement and every word. It was clear that this was no longer a routine hearing. The balance of power had shifted, and Crockett knew it. Crockett began with a series of questions that initially seemed procedural, but her strategy was subtle. Each query layered on the previous bias, exposing ambiguities in prior rulings while also highlighting the importance of transparency for public trust. Her tone was never accusatory. Instead, it was precise, deliberate, and unrelentingly factual. "Judge Kagan," Crockett asked, "in reviewing precedent from the past 5 years, how does the application of discretionary authority in these cases align with public expectations of fairness?" Kagan's brow furrowed slightly. "Congresswoman, discretion in the judiciary exists to ensure that legal interpretations are flexible within the bounds of law. The public expectation is balanced against legal consistency." Crockett nodded, flipping to a new document. "Understood. However, there are multiple instances where similar cases produce conflicting outcomes. Could these discrepancies be minimized to enhance public trust?" The subtlety of Crockett's approach became evident. She wasn't challenging authority outright. She was methodically illustrating a gap between legal practice and public perception. The room sensed her strategy: build credibility first, then introduce the tension point. As the discussion progressed, Crockett introduced comparative case files. Each reference was meticulously cited, demonstrating her preparation. One by one, she walked Kagan through situations where judicial discretion had produced inconsistent results. The examples were concrete, but framed in a way that encouraged reflection, not confrontation. "What do you make of these patterns, Judge?" Crockett asked calmly. "How can the judiciary reconcile discretion with consistent public accountability?" Kagan paused, an uncharacteristic flicker of unease crossing her face. "The judiciary strives for consistency, Congresswoman, but each case has unique circumstances. Patterns may emerge, but they cannot dictate outcomes universally." Crockett leaned forward, her hands folded. "Judge, the public often sees these cases as separate, but when patterns suggest inconsistency, it erodes confidence. Isn't there a responsibility to address that perception?" The subtle challenge hung in the air. For the first time, Kagan responded with a measured hesitance, her words slightly slower than usual. Crockett's approach had not provoked hostility. Instead, it had commanded attention and reflection. A staffer whispered quietly to the judge, but Kagan continued, her voice steady, yet alert. "Congresswoman, perception is important, but judicial independence must remain inviolate." Crockett nodded, acknowledging the point. "Absolutely, Judge. Independence is critical. Yet transparency and accountability reinforce that independence. Without them, even well-intentioned decisions risk being misunderstood." The reporters in the back row exchanged looks. This was the moment that had captured online attention even before the hearing concluded. Social media feeds buzzed with commentary, and hashtags highlighting Crockett's composure began trending within minutes. Crockett didn't stop there. She moved to the next point: the implementation of procedural reforms and their interpretation across different circuits. "Judge Kagan," she said, "some reforms intended to improve efficiency have been inconsistently applied. Could inconsistent implementation undermine their intended impact?" Kagan considered the question, the pause revealing a momentary recalibration. "Congresswoman, implementation can vary due to local administrative processes, resources, and case specifics. It's an ongoing challenge." Crockett's follow-up was precise, almost surgical. Given that challenge, what mechanisms exist to ensure that reform measures fulfill their promise uniformly? How are anomalies addressed? The room was fully silent, save for the soft rustle of papers. Kagan's eyes met Crockett's, and for a fleeting moment, the judge's controlled exterior revealed recognition. Crockett was unflinching, prepared, and intent on clarity. Crockett allowed a short pause, letting the weight of the question settle. Then she shifted focus to recent high-profile cases that had sparked public debate. Each example was carefully chosen to highlight the tension between legal interpretation and public accountability without veering into sensationalism. "Judge Kagan," she said, "in cases where public scrutiny is heightened, how does the court balance transparency with the integrity of legal proceedings?" Kagan's voice was firm but tempered. "Transparency is essential, Congresswoman, but it must be balanced against confidentiality requirements and procedural fairness. The judiciary strives to communicate rationale while maintaining impartiality." Crockett nodded slowly. "Thank you, Judge. That balance is critical. Yet public trust also depends on perceiving that balance is applied consistently. Could additional measures improve clarity without compromising judicial independence?" The exchange ended with an unspoken acknowledgement. Crockett had steered the conversation into territory few expected, and she had done so without confrontation, yet with undeniable authority by the time the recess bell rang. It was evident to everyone, spectators, staff, and even Judge Kagan, that this hearing was no longer routine. Crockett had set a tone that demanded focus, reflection, and attention. She hadn't sought to embarrass or provoke. She had sought clarity. And in doing so, she had created a viral moment that would be remembered far beyond the confines of the room. As she gathered her documents, Crockett allowed herself a brief, calm smile. She knew the next segment would raise the stakes even higher, and she was ready. The room had settled after the recess, but the air was thick with anticipation. Everyone present aides, journalists, even the committee clerks sensed that the next phase of the hearing would define the narrative. Jasmine Crockett returned to her seat with calm authority. Her documents neatly organized, her eyes focused, her posture commanding attention without demanding it. Judge Alina Kagan, usually unshakable, was subtly alert, her measured expression betraying a flicker of recognition. Crockett was not merely prepared, she was relentless. Crockett began with a question that immediately tightened the tension. "Judge Kagan," she said evenly, "in reviewing recent case procedures, There are instances where discretion was exercised in ways that produced inconsistent outcomes. How does the judiciary reconcile such discretion with public expectations of accountability? Kagan paused, her gaze steady but thoughtful. Congresswoman Crockett, discretion exists to allow courts to consider unique circumstances of each case. Consistency is important, yet flexibility ensures fairness. Crockett nodded, flipping to a fresh set of documents. Understood. However, when these discretionary decisions produce widely varying outcomes, public confidence can erode. Are there mechanisms to evaluate these variations and their implications for trust in the system? The subtle probing had shifted the dynamic. Kagan responded carefully, noting each point but without dismissing the line of questioning. Congresswoman, while mechanisms exist, transparency and interpretation are balanced against the integrity of judicial processes. Crockett leaned forward, her tone measured but assertive. Transparency ensures that independence is not perceived as opacity. Judge, if public perception aligns with fairness, credibility is strengthened. Isn't that a critical aspect of judicial responsibility? The exchange drew attention. Kagan's eyes narrowed slightly, signaling concentration. This was no longer routine. Crockett's approach was layered. She was methodical, using facts, references, and logic to build momentum, rather than relying on emotional appeals or aggressive confrontation. It was a masterclass in professional assertiveness. Cameras recorded every second, and online commentators noticed the subtle power shift. Social media feeds exploded with live tweets praising Crockett's yet incisive approach. Analysts began predicting that her strategy would be studied as an example of effective questioning and high profile. Hearings, then Crockett introduced another layer, the implications of procedural inconsistencies on public policy. Judge Kagan, when precedents vary and procedural interpretations differ, how does the judiciary ensure that these decisions do not unintentionally influence policy outcomes or public perception of legality? The pause that followed was significant. Kagan's voice remained composed but slower, measured as though carefully weighing each word. Congresswoman, the judiciary interprets law. Any policy implications are secondary and unintended, but I recognize that perception matters. Crockett continued seamlessly. Perception is not merely a byproduct, Judge. It directly affects confidence in the legal system. Without it, the system risks losing its credibility. Therefore, ensuring clarity in discretionary decisions is not optional. It is fundamental. As she spoke, Kagan adjusted her posture slightly, leaning in. For the first time, the judge seemed to acknowledge Crockett's methodical precision as a challenge, not a confrontation. Every procedural nuance Crockett raised was backed by documentation, case studies, and precedent analysis. It was clear she had anticipated every possible deflection. The tension escalated as Crockett moved to a controversial, high-profile case that had sparked debate among the public. Judge Kagan, in Case 5-7-C. Discretionary decisions led to varied interpretations at multiple levels of the court. How do you reconcile these outcomes with the principle of equal justice under the law? Kagan's measured response was deliberate. Each case has unique facts. Consistency is important, yet the law allows for nuance. It is the responsibility of appellate review to address discrepancies. Crockett nodded, unfazed. Appellate review is critical, Judge. But proactive transparency at the initial stages can prevent misinterpretation and preserve public trust. Do you agree that early clarity might reduce the perception of inconsistency? The courtroom grew quieter, the significance of the discussion evident to all. Staffers and reporters realized this was no ordinary inquiry. Crockett's approach was strategic, fearless, and grounded in facts, emphasizing accountability without undermining authority. She paused briefly, letting the gravity of her question settle. then presented the final document set, comparative analyses, showing patterns of discretionary decisions and their varying outcomes across jurisdictions. Judge Kagan, these examples demonstrate how interpretation can influence public perception. The question is not only legality, but credibility. How can courts ensure both simultaneously? Kagan studied the documents. For the first time, there was a subtle tension in her expression, an acknowledgement that Crockett's questioning was both precise and unavoidable. It was a delicate power moment, a reminder that truth, preparation, and clarity could command attention. Even in front of the most experienced judge, Crockett concluded the session with calm composure. "Judge, I thank you for your patience and insights. My aim has never been to challenge authority, but to ensure clarity, accountability, and public trust. The system relies on transparency as much as discretion." As the gavel marked a brief recess, Crockett gathered her notes. The audience, both in the room and online, understood the unspoken message. This was a turning point. The questioning had escalated stakes, shifted dynamics, and demonstrated that careful preparation, factual grounding, and composure could influence even the highest levels of authority. Observers noted the subtle shift. Judge Kagan, while maintaining her professional demeanor, had recognized Crockett's unwavering determination. The viral headlines were inevitable, not due to conflict, but due to the clarity and confidence that had changed the energy of the room. Crockett's calm exit from the session left everyone anticipating the next phase. She had set the stage for what would become a decisive, high-impact conclusion in the final segment. The final session of the hearing had begun, and the courtroom was electric with anticipation. What had started as a procedural discussion was now a stage for a broader demonstration of strategy, clarity, and accountability. Jasmine Crockett entered with the same poise she had displayed throughout the prior sessions. Every step, every gesture reflected calm confidence. The air seemed to hum with the awareness that something consequential was about to unfold. Judge Alina Kagan, while composed, was unmistakably attentive. The subtle tension in her posture indicated that she recognized Crockett's unwavering focus. This wasn't just another inquiry. It was a demonstration of disciplined, evidence-driven questioning. And its implications stretched far beyond the room's walls. Crockett began the session with an observation that immediately set the tone. Judge Kagan, today I hope to explore how procedural consistency and public transparency intersect in ways that affect both perception and confidence in the judicial process. My goal is clarity, not confrontation. The judge nodded, acknowledging the statement. Congresswoman, I am prepared to discuss these points within the bounds of procedure and law. Crockett continued methodically, presenting a series of documents and comparative case studies that highlighted inconsistencies in discretionary decisions. Each example was factual, clearly referenced, and strategically organized to illustrate the broader implications for public trust. She asked, how can courts ensure that discretion does not inadvertently erode confidence in the system, especially in high-profile cases where public perception carries significant weight? Kagan responded with her usual calm precision, but there was a perceptible shift in tone. Congresswoman, it is a challenge to balance discretion with transparency. The judiciary must maintain independence while remaining accountable to legal standards and public expectation. Crockett's follow-up was sharp yet respectful. Independence and accountability are not mutually exclusive. Judge, both can coexist if transparency is embedded in procedural execution from the outset. Would you agree that proactive measures to clarify discretionary decisions could enhance public trust? The subtle tension in the room deepened. Observers sensed that Crockett's approach, a combination of respect, preparation, and strategic questioning, was steering the dialogue into uncharted territory. Kagan was forced to engage fully, considering the points carefully rather than relying on standard Procedural responses, moving to a high-profile case that had recently attracted national attention. Crockett asked Judge, in circumstances where similar cases produced divergent outcomes, how does the court justify these differences while preserving the perception of fairness? Kagan's response was measured, reflective, and deliberate. Each case is unique, Congresswoman. Discrepancies may occur due to factual differences, procedural context, or judicial interpretation. Consistency is important, yet nuance must be respected. Crockett nodded. Understood. However, transparency in reasoning and procedural clarity can help the public see that nuance is intentional and not arbitrary. Would it be possible to establish clearer communication protocols for such decisions? For the first time, the judge leaned forward slightly, acknowledging the precision and importance of Crockett's inquiry. This was no longer a routine hearing. The exchange had become a subtle intellectual duel, with both sides measured but fully engaged. Crockett concluded the session with a final statement that underscored the essence of her approach. Judge Kagan, my questions are rooted in the belief that public confidence is strengthened when discretion is paired with clarity. This ensures that decisions are not only legally sound, but also understandable and transparent to those they affect. The gavel struck, signaling the end of the session. The audience, reporters, staffers, and online viewers could feel the weight of the exchange. Crockett had navigated the tension masterfully, holding authority and respect while elevating public understanding. Judge Kagan, while maintaining composure, recognized Crockett's unflinching determination. The impact was immediate. News outlets highlighted Crockett's performance as an example of professional assertiveness and strategic intelligence. Analysts praised her ability to challenge high-level authority while remaining composed and grounded in facts. Social media buzzed with clips of her sharp, yet respectful, questioning. Across the nation, viewers discussed how clarity, preparation, and confidence could influence even the most established institutions. As Crockett left the room, she allowed herself a brief, calm smile. She had achieved more than answers. She had demonstrated that integrity, preparation, and strategic engagement could create meaningful change and command attention. The hearing would be remembered not for controversy or conflict, but for a model of accountability, civility, and public responsibility.